G'day YouTube, Warbles on a lot here. We're going to have a malt liquor video and we're talking about global warming again. This video is for Refried Bean Dip, who last night sent me a personal message telling me that he was a bit concerned about an article that he'd come across somehow, published by Quadrant Magazine, written by a bloke called Garth Paltridge, who claimed to be an emeritus climate scientist from the Commonwealth Scientific Industrial Research Organisation, the Australian CSIRO. And the article had been picked up by, of all things, Forbes.com, which is, they put out Forbes Business Review, a sort of in-house magazine for stockbrokers and investors, and people who want to make money on the making money market. So anyway, I pointed out to him that Quadrant is a magazine which, it's a literary journal, it's given to poetry, it's an extreme right-wing journal and has been since about the Vietnam War, but its prime claim to fame, Quadrant Journal was the first and most deeply hoaxed of everybody who got sucked into what's called the Ern Malley Hoax scandal. If you've never heard of Ern Malley or the Ern Malley Hoax, just Google it, E-R-N, new word, M-A-L-L-E-Y, Ern Malley Hoax. Right? And Quadrant is the poetry journal, the literary journal that got sucked in by that. Right, so this is the article from Quadrant dated January 22nd, 2014 by Garth Paltridge, and I'll just read it and have outbursts, okay? Label out, Coopers. 5.8% alcohol, 1.7 standard drunks, and I'm drinking in sunlight. Title, Climate Change's Inherent Uncertainties. The World Meteorological Organization of the United Nations took its first steps towards establishing the World Climate Program in the early 1970s, back when he had a job. Among other things, it held a conference in Stockholm to define the main scientific problems to be solved before reliable climate forecasting could be possible. The conference defined quite a number, but focused on just two. The first concerned an inability to simulate the amount and character of clouds in the atmosphere. Clouds are important because they govern the balance between solar heating and infrared cooling of the planet, and thereby are a control of Earth's temperature, a factor in the control, to be more precise. The second concerned an inability to forecast the behaviour of the oceans. Back in the 1970s, yes. Oceans are important because they are the main reservoirs of heat in the climate system. True. They have internal, more or less random, fluctuations on all sorts of timescales ranging from years through to centuries. Well, they seemed to be more or less random back in the 70s when this bloke was up on the field. These fluctuations cause changes in ocean surface temperature that in turn affect Earth's overall climate. The situation hasn't changed much in the decades since. Okay, so there's been no development of computers, there's been no development of remote sensors, there's been no development of undersea gliders that go down 6,000 feet, come back, and no fleets of them deployed, no satellite measurements, no, there's been no development since the 1970s because that's when Garth Paltridge stopped paying attention. He's frozen in a time bubble. Many of the problems of simulating the behaviour of clouds and oceans are still there, along with lots of other problems of lesser moment. And for many of the same reasons, perhaps the most significant is that climate models must do their calculations at each point of an imaginary grid of points spread evenly around the world at various heights in the atmosphere and depths of the ocean. That sounds really, really top grade to somebody who's never thought of it before, but to anybody who's been paying attention, this is stuff that was primary school even back in the 1970s. But this bloke was born in 1940, mind you. The calculations are done every hour or so of model time as the model steps forward into its theoretical future. Problems arise because practical constraints on the size of computers ensure that the horizontal distances between model grid points may be as much as a degree or two of latitude or longitude. That is to say, a distance of many tens of kilometres. Well, again, that's what it was like in the 70s, but it hasn't been like that for the past 15 years or so that I've been reading these scientist magazines. They talk about grid sizes of tenths of a kilometre. Now, a kilometre is a big grid these days. They have bigger computers. They have better models. But he didn't know that. Doesn't want to know it. Illuminated tunnel vision. Focus on what you already know. Exclude anything else that might perturb your already preformed conclusions. That sort of distance is much larger than the size of a typical piece of cloud was once. As a consequence, simulation of clouds requires a fair amount of guesswork, as it did, as to what might be a suitable average of whatever is going on between the grid points of the model. Even if the experimental observations suggest that the models get the averages roughly right, even if they get it right for a short-term forecast, there is no guarantee that they will get them right for atmospheric conditions several decades into the future. He's got his head up his arse. Among other problems, small errors in the numerical modelling of complex processes have a nasty habit of accumulating with time. Yep, if they'd never actually updated any of the models since the 1970s to now and still expected the 1970s models to be current today, he might have kind of a point, but the fact is they've updated both the models and the modelling equipment and the computers and the observational data, and it all fine-tunes each other. So the modelling's pretty bloody good today. And he tries to sweep under the carpet the fact that observational data is now backing up the predictions that were made back then, the predictions he disagreed with. And the observations are that we are on track for between 5 and 8 degrees of warming. And he's trying to say that there's no evidence that humanity has caused any of it because he didn't want to think so back then, and he's never moved from that spot since. Again, because of this grid point business, oceanic fluctuations and eddies smaller than the distance between the grid points of a model are unknown to that model. Stating the fucking obvious. This would not be a problem, except that eddies in turbulent fluids can grow larger and larger. A small random eddy in the real ocean can grow and appear out of nowhere as far as a forecasting model is concerned. Yeah, the butterfly flaps its wings in Thailand, and that breaks off a thermal bubble of air that goes up to become a thunderstorm that runs around the fucking planet and becomes a cyclone that wipes out Darwin. Yeah? The butterfly effect. No? He's rooted in the 70s. He thinks all this is new, and he writes it as if it was new. And Quadrant, the fucking magazine for right-wing poets, what the fuck do they know? They've got somebody who once upon a time had a job at the CSIRO until 1981, and he wants to publish climate science denialism and global warming scepticism in their poetry magazine. They're fucking delighted. Can appear out of nowhere as far as a forecasting model is concerned and make a dog's breakfast of the forecast from that time on. All of the above is background to one of the great mysteries of the climate change issue. Virtually all the scientists directly involved in climate prediction are aware of the enormous problems and uncertainties still associated with their product. How then? Well, they are aware that there are problems, and that's why they work very hard to crunch the numbers to get the bugs out of their models and their predictions. How then is it that those of them involved in the latest report of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, IPCC, can put their hands on their hearts and maintain there is a 95% probability that human emissions of carbon dioxide have caused most of the global warming that has occurred over the last several decades? Well, it's because they pay attention to the data, to the chemistry, to the physics, to the quantities involved, and the mathematics and thermal physical chemistry of greenhouse effect and greenhouse gases, and carbon dioxide being one of them. They've been well understood for 150 years at least. Bear in mind that the representation of clouds in climate models, bracket, and of water vapour, which is intimately involved with cloud formation, close bracket, is such as to amplify the forecast warming from increasing atmospheric carbon dioxide on average over most of the models by a factor of about 3. That's one view on it. Another view is that the shading of the ground and the ocean underneath the cloud creates an amount of cooling to the point where nobody has any clear idea, last I've been reading, as to what the effect of clouds are, but they are leaning towards the idea that water vapour is acting as a greenhouse gas to a degree that it is overwhelming the shadow effect. Right? but it's still very iffy. The point is, he's basing his entire polemical argument on the iffiness of 40 years ago. He's not talking about the much less iffies that we're talking about now. In other words, 2/3 of the forecast rise in temperature derives from this particular model characteristic. Despite what the models are telling us, and perhaps because it is models that are telling us, no scientist close to the problem and in his right mind, okay, all of a sudden this 40 years ago atmospheric scientist is claiming psychiatric qualifications. No scientist in his right mind, when asked the specific question, would say that he is 95% sure that the effect of clouds is to amplify rather than reduce the warming effect of increasing carbon dioxide. No, they wouldn't tell you that they're 95% sure that it'll amplify the effect of carbon dioxide. They'll tell you that it has its own effect, which is a different argument entirely. So he's just set up a straw man and shot it down, and he feels very proud, and he's got big balls, he thinks. If he is not sure that clouds amplify global warming, he cannot be sure that most of the global warming is a result of increasing carbon dioxide. Circular argument leading nowhere. Bear in mind, too, that no scientist close to the problem and in his right mind, yes, Paltridge, the great psychiatrist, when asked the specific question, would say there is only a very small possibility, that is less than 5%, that internal ocean behaviour could be a major cause of warming over the past half-century. Well, actually, they know a lot more about the oceans now than they did 40 years ago, and they'd tell him that he's fucking wrong there too. They're absolutely certain that the warming we're experiencing on the surface and in the atmosphere has got fuck all to do with the deep ocean throwing up heat, as he's attempting to suggest may be the case. And because it may be the case, he wants to debunk all of climate science on his, minority view that nobody supports. That internal ocean behaviour could be a major cause. He would be particularly careful not to make such a statement now that there has been no significant warming over the recent 15 or so years. Okay, point of order. This is crap. What happened was the atmosphere warmed, there became a heat gradient, and the heat flowed from the warm to the cold, as the laws of thermodynamics say it will, into the ocean. And as the surface of the ocean warmed, it then began moving into the deep ocean. And from memory, it's a month or so since I read the article, the deep ocean is warming really fast at the moment. Backscroll or search the title of Global Warming Slowdown, Reality Check, bracket, New Scientist. Full stop. Stick that whole phrase in inverted commas. I posted it on the 11th of January 2014. It's only got 110 views, but there are 5 likes, no dislikes, and 14 comments. And it basically, I read a 5-page New Scientist article explaining the flaws in what this half-wit just said. So, you want the actual data? Go and look at me reading that. In the mad scurry to find reasons for the pause, there is no pause, and to find reasons for an obvious failure of the models to simulate the pause, no, nobody failed in anything. They simply didn't foresee that the heat would get stored in the ocean and then come back at us in the form of storms, which are busting the infrastructure necessary to run the economy. Suddenly we are hearing that perhaps the heat of global warming is being, quote, hidden in the deep ocean. Yeah, well, that's right, it's all pretty simple mathematics. And like I said, they've got these 1,600 or so deep ocean buoys that, glide down to 6,000 feet and then come up slowly taking temperature measurements and glide down. All very clever. Plenty of articles on it. He hasn't read of any of them. In other words, we're being told that some internal oceanic fluctuation may have reduced the upward trend in global temperature. Yes. It's not an upward trend in global temperature, it's an upward trend in sea surface and atmospheric temperature. It is therefore more than a little strange that we are not hearing from the IPCC, bracket, or at any rate not hearing very loudly, close bracket, that some natural internal fluctuation of the system may have given rise to most of the earlier upward trend. Well, actually, no, it's not strange, because the deep ocean, where the heat is being stored at the moment, was never warmer than the subsurface of the ocean, and the surface wasn't warmer than the atmosphere. So he's, again, setting up a fucking straw man, built on circular logic. The guy's a dickhead. In the light of all this, total bullshit, we have at least to consider the possibility that the scientific establishment behind the global warming issue has been drawn into the trap of seriously overstating the climate problem. Tell that to the people in Victoria, on the outskirts of Melbourne, who are having yet another heat wave at the end of yet another drought, after yet another flood, and today they're having a catastrophic bushfire day with temperatures in the 40s, and they've got people being told to shelter in place in suburbs on the western edge of Melbourne. South Australia's on fire, Victoria's on fire, southern New South Wales is on fire, Western Australia's just been burnt. Queensland and Western New South Wales are in the grip of a drought that's sending all the cow farmers broke. Yeah. Overstated, huh? Drawn into the trap of overstating the climate problem, or what is much the same thing, seriously understating the uncertainties associated with the climate problem. In other words, he wants to keep the share prices up to maintain his superannuation until he dies, and then his grandkids can just go and get fucked. I predict they'll dig him up and use his head for a soccer ball. In its effort to promote the cause, it is a particularly nasty trap in the context of science because it risks destroying, perhaps for centuries to come, the unique and hard-won reputation for honesty which is the basis of society's respect for scientific endeavour. That's exactly precisely what he's doing. It's projection here. And I have passed exams in psychiatry. Got 100% in them too. Trading reputational capital for short-term political gain isn't the most sensible way of going about things. Yeah, well, tell that to the Liberal National Party as global warming gets worse and all their constituents lose their fucking houses. The trap was set in the late 1970s or thereabouts, when he lost his job, when the environmental movement first realised that doing something about global warming would play to quite a number of its social agendas. Okay, now the right-wing side of politics maintains that all greenies and environmentalists are communists, and they base this on the idea that Hitler was a vegetarian and Hermann Goering was a forest conservationist. Therefore, greenies are communists. It's a well-known fact in right-wing circles. You ask them. At much the same time, and Hitler was a socialist too, you see, National Socialism. They can't see any difference between Nazism and communism. Strange, really, because most of them are actually fascists on the right-wing side of politics. Realised that doing something about global warming would play to quite a number of its social agendas. At much the same time, it became accepted wisdom around the corridors of power that government-funded scientists, bracket, that is most scientists, should be required to obtain a goodly fraction of their funds and salaries from external sources. External anyway to their own particular organisation. The scientists in environmental research laboratories, since they are not normally linked to any particular private industry, were forced to seek funds from other government departments. In turn, this forced them to accept the need for advocacy, no clear link there, and for the manipulation of public opinion. For that sort of activity, an arm's-length association with the environmental movement would be a union made in heaven. Among other things, it would provide a means by which the scientists could distance themselves from responsibility for any public overstatement of the significance of their particular research problem. Total conjecture, sour grapes, bitterness. He hasn't had a job in climate science since 1981 when he got ousted from CSIRO. That's what emeritus means. Used to be, has been, X. The trap was partially sprung in climate research when a number of the relevant scientists began to enjoy the advocacy business. The enjoyment was based on a considerable increase in funding and employment opportunity. The increase, see, he lost his job, they kept theirs, therefore they're arseholes, you ask him. Considerable increase in funding and employment opportunity. The increase was not so much on the hard science side of things, but rather in the emerging fringe institutes and organisations devoted, at least in part, to selling the message of climatic doom. A new and rewarding research lifestyle emerged which involved giving of advice to all types and levels of government, the broadcasting of unchallengeable opinion to the general public, and easy justification for attendance at international conferences. This last in some luxury by normal scientific experience and at a frequency previously unheard of. Okay, so the rise in the trend of conferences to be held in overseas tourist destinations has nothing to do with the rise in cheap airfares brought about by mass construction of jet airliners in the 1960s and 70s. So he's trying to equate the number of overseas conferences he went to when he was a young scientist with the number of overseas conferences that the young scientists who replaced him get to go to. Total fucking sour grapes and bullshit. Easy justification for attendance at international conferences, this last in some luxury by normal scientific experience. What he grew up with is normal, everything else is aberrant. And at a frequency previously unheard of. Oh, poor old prick. Somewhere along the line it came to be believed by many of the public and indeed by many of the scientists themselves that climate researchers were the equivalent of knights on white steeds fighting a great battle against the forces of evil. Evil, that is, in the shape of big oil and its supposedly unlimited money. The delusion was more than a little attractive. Well, big oil, unlimited money. At the moment the planet burns 45 million barrels of oil per day for road transport. That's a fair bit of money involved. The trap was fully sprung when many of the world's major national academies of science, brackets such as the Royal Society in the UK, the National Academy of Science in the USA, and the Australian Academy of Science persuaded themselves to issue reports giving support to the conclusions of the IPCC. The reports were touted as national assessments that were supposedly independent of the IPCC and of each other, but of necessity were compiled with the assistance of, and in many cases at the behest of, many of the scientists involved in the IPCC international machinations, i.e. the people who did the work and understand the observations and wrote the reports got to submit them to the IPCC, and then the people in each different country checked each other's reports. Yeah, it's called peer review. He's whinging about that because nobody will peer review his work because it's a lot of shit. Well, the most prestigious of the institutions of science formally nailed their colours to the mast of the politically correct. Since that time, 3 or 4 years ago, okay, so he reckons it's 2010, there has been no comfortable way for the scientific community to raise the spectre of serious uncertainty about the forecast of climatic disaster. In other words, the consensus is against him, so they're all got to be wrong. It can no longer use the environmental movement as a scapegoat if it should turn out that the threat of global warming has no real substance. If. Look at the fucking data. Australia last year, for the 4th year in a row, had the hottest day, the hottest week, the hottest month, and the hottest year out of the last 15 years. Last year was the hottest on record since whitefellas turned up and started taking records. If it should turn out that the threat of global warming has no real substance, it can no longer escape prime responsibility. If it should turn out, in the end, that doing something in the name of mitigation of global warming is the costliest scientific mistake ever visited on humanity. In other words, he doesn't want anything to stand in the face of making more profits now, even though the consensus of opinion is that it's going to kill his grandchildren. Fuck him with a barbed wire dildo. The current redirection of global funds in the name of climate change is on the order of $1 billion a day, and in the future, to quote US Senator Everett Dirksen, quote, $1 billion here and $1 billion there, pretty soon we'll be talking about real money, unquote. At the same time, the average man in the street, a sensible chap who by now can smell the signs of an oversold environmental campaign from miles away, is beginning to suspect that it is politics, like Tony Abbott's politics, rather than science, which, like, that's why Tony Abbott just fired 650 people at the CSIRO and has the first government in Australia since the Second World War to have no Department of Science, no Minister of Science. It is politics rather than science which is driving the issue of wanting Australia to be a cheap energy country. Scientists, most scientists anyway, that means him and his mates, may be a bit naive, but they are not generally wicked, idiotic or easily suborned either by money or the politically correct. So whatever might be the enjoyment factor associated with supporting officially accepted wisdom, And whatever might be the constraints applied by the scientific powers that be, it is still surprising that the latest IPCC report has been tabled with almost no murmur of discontent from the lower levels of the research establishment. It's because they fucking understand that it's right, you dickhead. What has happened to the scepticism that is supposedly the lifeblood of the scientific inquiry? We're sceptical of the dribblings of a bloke who hasn't worked in the field for 40 years and is in the pocket of the fossil fuel lobby. The answer probably gets back to the uncertainty of it all. The chances of proving that climate change over the next century will be large enough to be disastrous are virtually nil. Tell that to the people burning on the western suburbs of Melbourne today. Garth Paltridge, you paltry piece of pusillanimous pissantery. For the same reason, the chances of a climate sceptic, or anyone else for that matter, proving the disaster theory to be oversold are also virtually nil. So he's admitted that he can't fucking prove anything because the data's all against him, the observations are all against him. The problem is that climate research necessarily involves an enormous resources and is a game for institutions and organisations. Scepticism is an occupation for individuals. Yeah, well, I'm a fucking individual and I'm not sceptical of global warming. Things being as they are in the climate change arena, scepticism by an individual within the system can be fairly career limiting. See, he's admitting that's what he lost his job for, not being guided by the data but going with his ideology. In any event, most individual scientists have a conscience and are reluctant to put their heads above the public parapet in order to propound a view of things that may prove inherently unprovable. In short, there is more than enough uncertainty about the forecasting of climate to allow normal humans to be at least reasonably hopeful that global warming might not be nearly as bad as is currently touted. Climate scientists, and indeed scientists in general, are not so lucky. They have a lot to lose if time should prove them wrong. Garth Paltridge is an emeritus professor at the University of Tasmania and a fellow of the Australian Academy of Science. Right? Once he used to be a scientist. He's the author of the climate caper, Facts and Fallacies of Global Warming. Right? So this was all in the interests of quantum promoting his book. He was a chief research scientist, not the chief, a chief, with the CSIRO Division of Atmospheric Research until 1981. There you go. So that's nearly half an hour. I suppose I will probably read the other article, the op-ed, which used that piece of shit as its source material and which was published in Forbes Business Review, and you know, Richard Mann, Refried Bean Dip, wants me to review that too. So here end of the first review. Ciao.